Hi, Captain Peter Cutsie in South Korea, and this is my briefing room. Tonight, we're going to brief on FMC failure. This will be part one of three. If you notice on the screen, this PowerPoint main menu, I've got a caution that this PowerPoint show contains PNG files. Your company updated manual, of course, overrides the content herein in any PowerPoint that I create, if issued later. You'll find there are very few changes, but if there are changes, I'll be updating, but your company manual has precedence, of course. I don't like using picture files in PowerPoint slides. I think it takes away from the professionalism personally. I've only done it because I'll be using this PowerPoint presentation to make these MP4 video briefings. The actual PDF files from which this information is taken are actually created and tailored without changing them, but skimming them down to maybe 1 or 2 pages so that you don't have to search through an entire PDF file. And I've uploaded them into Google Drive into the PowerPoint package folder under supporting documents folder for each PowerPoint presentation that I make, where I use PNG or JPEG files. To make a long story short, you'll be able to actually view them properly and more professionally in a PDF format on Google Drive. Thank you for that. And any slide that you see in future presentations that have a picture in it, you'll have a small PNG in red at the top to remind everyone that it's a picture. Okay, the objective. The objective for this three-part series of FMC failure is to identify FMC malfunctions, to restore dual FMC operation where applicable. Well, it would be in any case if you lost one or two, and configure for single FMC operation if that is the case, and or resume conventional navigation. So let's have a look at that. Now, we'll go back to the main menu. Let's look at the captain's FMC failure first. We'll look at a slide here where we can identify. So this is a single FMC failure, and the captain's ND would show a map message and a VTK message. The VTK message would come into view first, and the map message perhaps somewhere after 10 seconds, 10 to 15 seconds, indicating you've lost all the information and on the map. And looking at the first officer's ND, it is operating. So that's what you would see up front to start with, if it was the captain's FMC that failed. And two other things on the lower pedestal, both the captain's and the first officer's CDU would be blank. Let's now go to if the single FMC failure was in fact the FOs. So the FOs, again, the data on the nav display, VTK track, and then within 10 to 15 seconds, a map message and no information, whereas the captain's nav display is functioning normally. And a little different presentation on the CDUs. The CDUs actually have information on them and indicating in the scratch pad a single FMC operation, plus the FMC PRST message in front of the captain on his instrument panel. All right, that's how we can identify. And really, what to do, well, we'll talk about that later. It's obvious that the pilot flying should be the pilot with the operable FMC. It makes sense because you're navigating in an RNAV environment. And you aviate first, you navigate and communicate, and then take care of checklists later once you get safely airborne and climbing. We're going to say it happened, let's say, right after takeoff. In part 2 and part 3, we do some other scenarios. But for this first one, we're going to simulate leaving Dubai, or I should say Muscat Airport, OOMS, and off of runway 08 left. And then we're going to return to Muscat doing a localizer approach using conventional navigation with a dual FMC failure in part 2 of my briefings. Before we go any further, let's have a look at some of the FMC alert messages that you could get that could be a precursor to an FMC failure. These are buried away in the FCOM, and it would pay for you to have a look at them. Here again, this is a picture file, but I've actually made a PDF file for you, as I mentioned at the beginning of this briefing. So the column titles are the alerting message, and then the center column is the cause, and the third column is the corrective action. Well, for an FMC tune disagree with update 10.5 and later, it means that the cause is an approach that utilizes FMC generated glide path is in the active flight plan, but an approach nav aid has been tuned with glide slope on. So confirm that tune frequency and approach selected in the FMC are both consistent. Make sure whatever you've got tuned in the FMC is what you've actually got tuned for the ILS frequencies and the ILS the courses set on the MCP. That is important. All right, let's go to the next slide here. There are a few more I want to have a look at. Now, FMC disagree for updates 10.6 and 10.7. During an approach or on the ground, monitored parameters required for the dual FMC operation are in disagreement, the monitored parameters. So the corrective action is monitor FMCs closely. Both FMCs remain online. Limit approaches to a single FMC only, if desired. Revert to single FMC operation in the section. This is not QRH, this is airmanship, and you should know your airplane. Normally, FMCs just don't fail before giving you some precursor. Somehow, you'll get some kind of a clue that you probably will have an FMC failure, maybe. All right, so it's good to know this background information. So FMC disagree, the same message, the same alerting message, but for updates 10.8 and later. So during approach or on the ground, monitored parameters required for the dual FMC operation are in disagreement, all right? So message will remain displayed until the condition has been resolved. The FMC does not check for a match, or I should say for mock and indicated airspeed miscompares on the ground. So on the ground, they don't look for a miscomparison. So the corrective action is monitor FMCs closely. Smell a rat here coming. Maybe you're going to end up with a failure. Both FMCs remain online. That's the other thing. You're not going to lose your FMCs with these messages. Now, FMC disagree vertical 10.8A and later. So you have a deviation, an FMC airspeed or FMC Mach value disagreement before the FMCs. So the suggestion, corrective action, is do not move the FMC source select switch. So these messages are pertinent, and you really should be aware of them. And we'll go back to the main menu. So now we've kind of jumping back to what we did initially. We know how to identify an operative FMC. Like I mentioned before, the pilot flying should be the pilot with the operable FMC. If it happened right on takeoff, continue flying. Use the autopilot. All your LNAV, VNAV will be working fine on one FMC. But you've got to do a checklist. And that's what we'll get into tonight. Just before we do, we'll have a look at a dual FMC failure. And yes, you guessed right, both captain's ND and first officer's ND have the no data, except for the BTK and MAP, and both CDUs are blank. We'll be getting into that later in part 2. Right now, let's have a look at a checklist. So we're going to discuss the single FMC failure QRH. Here again, it's a PNG file. Remember what I said at the beginning. I have tailored the PDF files in Google Drive just so that you can study and focus on a single FMC failure, and then we'll look at a dual FMC failure in part 2. So the FMC fail displayed VTK followed by map failure flags on one or both navigation displays. So the VTK comes first, the map comes second, about 10 to 15 seconds approximately later. So let's get right into the checklist here. We'll kind of zoom in if we can. And we can, indeed. To restore dual FMC operation, configure for single FMC operation or resume conventional navigation. Okay, so pilot monitoring would of course be reading the checklist and check both navigation display map modes and FMC CDUs. We've done that, we've looked at them. Choose one. Well, no FMC data on the captain's and first officer's nav display modes and no FMC data on both CDUs. Well, that wasn't the case. One FMC was operating. Nav display on one side was working, all right? So number 2, no FMC data on the captain's navigation display. That means the left FMC has failed. Yes, we saw that scenario. Or it could have been the opposite. No FMC data on the first officer's navigation display. In addition to that, the message light illuminated, and the single FMC operation scratch pad message is shown. And I showed you that. That's the difference between single FMC captain side failing or single FMC first officer side failing. Just a little different presentation. Remember, the CDUs on the first will actually have, if it's the first officer's FMC, the CDUs will both have scratch pad message, as I showed you, and the alerting light up in front of the captain on his forward instrument panel. All right, so go to step 3. The system source select switch, both on left or both on right. Well, let's just go and have a look at that. I've taken a little picky so that right out of the FCOM and blown it up so you can have a look. Here it is here in the whole overhead panel in front of the captain. So the FMC has a normal position switch, and then both on left and both on right. Okay, so let's go back to the main menu, and we're looking at single FMC failure. So let's say both on left or both on right. Let's say the captain's FMC is the good one. So make the selection to the left. Okay, select the operating FMC. Wait 1 minute, punch your clock. Check the FMC left and FMC right bearing distance information on pause shift page 3-3. Choose one. Bearing distance information for both FMCs are displayed. Okay, so FMC source select switch, back to normal. End of checklist. However, if the bearing and distance information for only a single FMC is displayed on that page, continue with single FMC operation, end of checklist. Can we continue to Dubai? Of course we can. You're in an RNAV environment, you're fine. In part 2, we'll talk about something a little different. All right, let's go back to the main menu. So we virtually, that's fairly simple. And if you were on an ETOPS flight out over ocean and you lost an FMC, well, there are other things that airmanship dictate and your SOPs. You may continue to destination, or you may go to an en route alternate. That would be part of your company's SOPs, and also you as a crew member with your captain, depending on when it happened. One FMC, you could continue once you are in the ETOPS area, following ETOPS rules. So as long as the rules didn't say, or your company SOPs didn't say that you must land immediately at an en route alternate. Well, you've got a full FMC, it's operating, so continue. And I'm sure your SOPs would say that. All right, that will conclude part 1 of the FMC FAIL series. Look for part 2 coming shortly. The information, of course, I always will put it on screen in case you want to contact me. It'll be handy on screen. Thanks for watching, and thanks for subscribing to my Google Drive package. I'll be updating it weekly. This is the first of 3 in the FMC series. Thank you.